So in case you don't know me, my name is Matt Melendrez. I'm on staff with Cru. And in case you weren't there, this is a follow-up from a talk I gave last week at a Cru weekly meeting. And the title of it was called Be a Man. And we looked at the different social constructs that lead to sexual violence. And we heard from my really good friend, Catherine, who shared her story. And so yeah, today is more of a response, a little bit more practical, diving a little bit more of different terms and sharing another story. And so, just real briefly, last week we looked at how our social constructs of masculinity lead to pride and shame, which lead to sexual violence, and how that we have a culture of victim blaming and silence, which continues to perpetuate these issues. And so last week was kind of more like a, why does this exist? How does it exist? And today is going to be a little bit more practical of what do these different things mean, and maybe even more practical, how do we respond? More than just changing culture, but in a moment, very practically, how do you respond to someone who discloses to you they've been sexually assaulted, either in the current day or in their past? So, first thing we're going to do is look at the different types of abuse, and it's the beginning part of the packet. So there's 7 different types of abuse that are kind of general categories. And I'll kind of give some examples just so you guys understand these. But we have physical, psychological, economic, verbal, emotional, sexual, and spiritual. These are all forms of abuse that a lot of shelters will cater towards and that we see in domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and also in relationships. And so physical is kind of a little self-explanatory. It's using physical force. So not sexual abuse, but physical hitting, slapping, any form of physical contact that's not sexual is physical. Psychological would be, let's say a wife comes home, or husband, but this is very common when it comes to marriages. Let's say a wife comes home and the husband takes down all the doors so she can never have privacy. He takes away her keys so she's not allowed to leave the house. And so there's like the psychological, like you can never get alone, and just complete control. And one that can cross over in these two, and we've seen this in our crisis counseling, is like maybe a guy holding a pair of scissors to a woman and like threatening her. So that although that isn't physical, it's still very much psychological and can be just as damaging. So there's psychological, there's economic, where there's complete control of finances. We have situations where women come home, they have to give up all their credit cards, all their money, and the husband has complete control. There's no economic freedom at all. Verbal is just exactly what it sounds like, putting someone down with words, degrading them, you're worthless, you're this, you're that, so verbal abuse. We have emotional abuse, which is kind of similar to verbal, but it's a lot of manipulation. An emotional abuse could be trying to make the other person feel guilty or shame. You're the one that makes me angry, you're the one that makes me this, why aren't you good enough? And so there's kind of this emotional abuse. There's sexual abuse, which is what we really focused on last week, and then spiritual abuse. And this is actually really common, and I actually was helping a friend out who lives up in Seattle, and her husband was living out verbal, psychological, emotional abuse consistently, and sometimes physical. And when she went to the church, they said, well, the only biblical way you can leave your husband is through adultery. And so she was kind of forced to stay in this marriage when there was all these forms of abuse occurring. And this is actually when I went through my training with the women's shelter, we had a whole section, a whole training on spiritual abuse of women who told their pastors, told priests, elders that they were being sexually, physically abused, and they said, well, he's not committing adultery, so you need to stay in the relationship. And then also using spirituality as a way to manipulate and get what you want. So these are all the different types of abuse that we encounter. And all types of abuse need healing and counseling and community. And so these are all the types of things that we see. So then we have the cycle of abuse. So cycle of abuse, this is more in the case of a relationship. So domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and relational violence. So cycle of abuse, this is the general cycle that tends to happen in a relationship. You have the abuse, so like someone hits someone, any sort of these things, but usually the cycle of abuse has to do with sexual and physical. So there's a hitting, there's a slapping, there's a beating of some sort happens. And then shortly after, it could be that same day, the days later, weeks later, but there's a reconciliation like, oh, I'm so sorry, baby, I didn't mean to hit you. But also in that, there'll be kind of like a blaming. Like, you shouldn't make me that angry. You shouldn't make me mad. And trying to put it on them. And so there's this, I'll never do it again. And so this is where there's a lot of false hope that's instilled in the relationship. Like, oh, things will change. So there's the reconciliation makeup. And then there's the calm phase where it's just, there's nothing happening. It's just calm. It'll never happen again. Kind of the continued reconciliation. No abuse is taking place here. Victim has so much hope that things will get better. And then tension building. You'll start seeing the early signs of an actual outbreak again, where you guys are getting in more fights, or it's just minor incidences that are leading to a whole breakout of abuse. So this is where the cycle just continues. And in the domestic violence or intimate partner violence case, if you're trying to help someone in this, usually it takes the statistic is, I think it takes a woman 7 attempts to leave this before she actually is able to leave it. Partly because she feels she can't break out of it. She doesn't know where to go. She's afraid of the husband. A lot of times if a woman gets out of this, then the husband starts threatening and trying to just threaten. And there's not a lot of support. There's more support today than there used to be. So this is the cycle that tends to happen. And we want to try to break people out of this cycle. And part of it is just educating. A lot of people who are in this cycle don't even know what this is. Yeah?
Is there an easier phase of the cycle that for someone to break out of it more so than another part of it?
Say it again?
Like, would it be easier for them to leave during the calm phase than during
Well, in the calm, there's a lot of hope. There's this hope like, oh, he didn't mean it. And so there's this kind of hope that starts building, and you want things to change and you don't want it to go back. But then it goes from hope to quick fear. And so it's just this really hard cycle. And oftentimes when it comes to this, the questions, and I kind of addressed it last week, but, well, what'd you do to make him hit you? Why don't you leave? Even the why don't you leave is a wrong question, because in this, the victim feels powerless. And so saying, why don't you leave? It's like, well, I can't. And the question should be, well, why is he hitting you? What's he doing? Like, not putting the blame on them. And even culturally trying to move, why don't you leave, to why does he hit? But it is a hard cycle to break. And usually it causes someone else to help them. And part of what we would do in the women's shelter is, can you close the door, please? Thanks. Part of what we would do in the women's shelter is sometimes if they do call us, like in this phase right here, we try to help them. What we'll try to help them when there is to create a safety plan. And so in some of these cases, it's like, hey, get your belongings, your ID, your credit cards together. And this is what happens sometimes on the phone. I would try to walk women through that, and they're literally trying to get their stuff while the husband's trying to beat down the door. And so you want to try to help them create a safety plan so then at the right moment they can get out. But it's not just leave, because you have documents, you have children, you have certain things that you need that can then be used against you later on in court. And unfortunately, our court system is not in the women's favor. So, yeah. Oh, I think I had a question. So that's the cycles of abuse. And one of the things, too, I didn't define last week is the difference between a victim and survivor. So a victim of sexual violence is the difference between victim and survivor, and you want the person to be able to self-identify. A victim still feels the tremendous effects of the assault or the violence or whatever it may be. They feel powerless, they feel hopeless, they feel completely not in control. Where someone who's a survivor feels that they don't feel at large that this is affecting them on a day-to-day basis. They feel kind of empowered. They feel that they're in control. And so you want the person who you're talking with to self-identify, because if you call someone a victim when they're really feeling like a survivor, it's like, wait, I don't take my power away from me, because what all this is about power and control. And so it's not in your notes, but part of what you want to help someone when they're disclosing to you is you want to help them be empowered again. You want to refocus the power from the abuser to the victim and survivor. And so even just telling a survivor, oh, you're a victim, it can make them feel that you're taking their power away from them. All the counseling, all the healing that they overcome. And then with the victim, if you call them a survivor and they're like, I do not feel like a survivor in any way. I am traumatized. And so on both cases, you want them to self-identify. And so a lot of times in this field, you'll hear victim and survivor used kind of interchangeably. So just for time's sake, there are signs of abuse in a relationship. We're not going to walk through that. Maybe if we have time, we can cover at the end. But I really want to get to the responding do's and don'ts. So if you go down, it's on the first page for the responding do's. The first part is to start by believing. And this is really huge because a lot of victims and survivors don't feel that they're going to be believed. In some cases, they question whether it even happened or what parts of it really happened. And so you want to start by saying, I believe you, and it's not your fault. You want to really assure them that it's not their fault. You want to thank them for having the courage to share. And a lot of times, if you're doing Bible studies and discipleship or at conferences, this will come up. And sometimes you're going to be the first person that they tell. And so you really want to thank them for the courage that they had to share that with you. And you want to express your love and care for them. And this may vary depending on the relationship. If it's someone who you just met, it may not be accurate to say, I love you or I still love you. But if it's someone who you care about and you want to express your love and care for them. And if it's someone who you don't know, you can really camp out and thanking them for their courage and just really affirming them. You want to be with them in silence, cry with them, be empathetic, and listen. And this is just so important because they just want to share their story. They don't need, and this is going to be in the don'ts, but they don't need you to give them a solution. They don't need you to try to give all these Bible verses and give your perspective. And so it's just in that moment, just be with them. If they want to be in silence for an hour, just be with them in silence. If you want to cry with them, be empathetic and just listen to their story. You want to ensure them of their safety. And even though they might be removed from the actual incident, there's this constant fear of their safety. And so you want to just assure them, with me, you're safe right now. Or in this place, we're safe. And just that word, it can be so soothing and just reaffirming of the safety they have with you. Or I'm safe. You want to ask what their needs are to come alongside them. Every person's going to have different needs. Every person responds so differently. Some people want to talk through it. Some people don't want to ever talk about it. Some people want to get help and tell their families. Some people never want to talk about it again. And it's really important to respect their desires in this process. So you want to ask what their needs are to come alongside them. And the next two, 7 and 8, you want to offer resources that you're aware of and offer to accompany them to a counselor. What I would say, kind of an asterisk with those, is don't try to push those things. You don't want to try to take their power away. Again, it's all about power and control. If you're trying to push too hard a resource that you think is helpful, or a book or a counselor, that can feel just a little too invasive and even trigger the feelings of not being empowered. And so you want to be careful of those things, but just let them know, hey, I have some resources if you ever want them. Or if you ever want to go to a counselor, I will walk with you and go with you. And out of an encouragement, when it comes to mental illness or abuse, sometimes I encourage, hey, you should even offer, you want me to sit with you in your first counseling session? Because you're safe, and they might open up more in that first counseling session. It's up to them. The don'ts. Don't blame the survivor or victim. And we saw this last week with Catherine. The first person she told, they asked, well, why were you drinking? So don't ask, what were you drinking? What were you wearing? Why were you with him? In some cases, it's if two people are hooking up, maybe they're making out, or maybe they even consent to oral sex, but if they consent to oral sex but not to sex, don't blame them. Like, well, you're going that far, and so you kind of wanted it, or it was you don't want to blame them, because on every point in sex, and this is when we talk to our campus, to fraternity and sororities, we're talking about consent every step of the way. So don't blame them if there was some sort of physicalness going on and then it led to this. Don't pressure the victim or survivor to tell you more information than they're ready to share. And don't be asking so many questions. You want to just continue to say, hey, whatever you want to share, I'm here, but don't say, who was it, when was it, show me that that's too invasive and too much. Don't assume the gender of the perpetrator before the victim shares. Last week I did really focus on men as perpetrators, and again, statistically, that is 99% of the cases. However, there are a lot of situations where, the statistics are so high, so 1% is still thousands of people who are being abused by women. And so you don't want to assume the gender. And don't focus on the perpetrator or express revenge. And so what I mean by that is, when someone's telling you this, if someone's telling me all this stuff, I don't want to respond out of, I'm going to go kick his ass, or tell me, you don't want to respond, you don't want to make it about the abuser. You don't want to, it's not about them, and it's not about you, because sometimes in those moments when you're just I want to just go do work, I'm so angry, that can be more about you than them. And so it's okay to express your hurt and your pain for them, but you want to try to mirror what they're saying and what they're feeling. If they're saying, I feel ashamed, I feel so sad that you feel shame, or I'm so upset this happened to you, but don't start talking about the abuser. It's not helpful. And also don't use Christian cliche things either. And this is probably just good for any form of suffering. But don't start spitting out Bible verses and God has a plan, or he's good, and all that stuff. It just does not help in that moment at all. And so you just want to be careful of how you're using Bible verses and God, your perspective. In summary, you just don't want to be trying to offer all this stuff. One of the greatest things you can offer someone in this situation is just your presence. And one of the things that I have realized over, not just in this area, in this field, but sometimes you're just in the dump. And whether, let's say, of abuse, or a divorce, or cancer, fill in the blank. And you're just in the dump, and sometimes what our natural tendency is to try to pull the person out of the dump. But what they really need, and someone needs, and I experienced this with my mom's cancer, is I just need someone in the dump with me. Because when you're in that dump, it's really hard to see the light. And it's a very lonely place to be when you are struggling to find the light. And you don't need someone trying to pull you into it. You need someone who's going to be there. And that's just an example of Jesus. He's the one that came down to earth and was with us in this dump, of earth and evil. And he was with us. He was with us. And so when it comes to this, you want to be with the person and not try to pull them out of it. It's their journey, their story. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about self-care in a few minutes, but one of the things I wanted to do today, and I never wanted to share his name to anyone just so out of respect for him, but last summer I was overseas, and we had an incident, actually a few incidents that happened in one day, and so I actually want Jacob to come up and share something that happened last summer, and we're just going to kind of walk through some things like that. But yeah, so thanks, Jacob. So this is Jacob. For those of you who don't know him, he's a fourth year, graduating this year, Wine of It major, and good friend, and I have the opportunity and blessing of discipling him. But yeah, Jacob, can you just share what happened last summer in Turkey?
Yeah, so we were in Turkey last summer with some friends, and we did a typical touristy thing, which is going to a Turkish bath. It's just basically like an underground bath where they will bathe you and scrub you clean and all of that stuff. So we're like, let's do it. Let's de-stress and have some fun. There's a guy's side, and then there's a separate girls' room. So all of us guys got ready and kind of went into a changing room, took off our clothes, put on a towel, went to this bath thing, and I was the first one to get washed. And so what you do is you're laying in this big room with this kind of marble table in the middle. And you lay there as the guy bathes you. And there's other people there as well. So it was kind of weird, kind of awkward, kind of cultural experience, but it was fine. What you do after that is you then go to a sauna to kind of open up the pores, I guess. And then from there, you go to this back room in this cave with a pool that has really cold water to refresh you. And since I was the first one to get washed, I went to the sauna. And then after that, I went to this cave in the back, one way in, one way out. And there was this guy, a Turkish man, who started following me from place to place. And he saw me go into that back cave, and he followed me there. When I got there, I kind of just, took off my towel, hopped in the little pool thing, and was really excited. I was like, oh, that was a cool experience, waiting for the rest of the guys to come in and just kind of like laugh and talk and de-stress. And when that door opened, I heard the door, and I said, oh, they're coming. But it wasn't the guys that came. It was this man. And he got in the pool, came up right next to me as close as he can. I'm like, this is kind of weird. We're both naked right now. Why are you so close? And trying to assume the best in him, he said he spoke English. I thought he was just excited to meet an American. But then he kept reaching for me and trying to grab me. From there, I tried to kind of get away, and he saw that I was looking to escape. So he got ahead of me, and he blocked the only exit out, and took my towel, and I was just kind of trapped underground in a foreign country with this Turkish man. And he made me get out and stand there completely naked and exposed, and he blocked the entrance and masturbated while looking at me. And I don't know exactly how long I was in there. I don't know exactly how I got out, to be honest. But I did, and he still kept following me from place to place while we were still there. But just being used for another man's pleasure, sexual pleasure against my will, it just kind of wrecked me. And I kind of finally experienced that from what everyone says is sexual assault. It does happen to men. It does happen to grown men, but you don't want to accept that in the moment or moments after either. So that's kind of the brief story of what happened last summer.
How did you feel afterwards?
There were a lot of feelings that went around. The first one, I guess I wanted to deny it. I didn't want to accept the fact that I had just been sexually assaulted. But there was just overwhelming sense of shame and dirtiness and just this inability to feel loved again. I kind of lost sight of who I am. And instead I just felt alone and abandoned. When I was stuck in a cave underground, I did feel just completely abandoned, both by the Lord, by friends, family, everything. Just stuck overall.
In the next couple of days and weeks, how did the group that you were with and family and friends respond?
The group responded really well. I did tell the guys kind of in the moment and in a joking manner so that they would almost laugh to get me through it, because we still had to be there. And it didn't really settle in until you asked me later that night. We were in the hotel and you just asked me how I was doing, and it kind of clicked, and I realized that what happened. And we did sit down and talk with the rest of the guys and talk more seriously about the incident, about being sexually assaulted and how to respond to that. And so it was just a long process of healing. When I told family, I remember I got back to the States and I was eating breakfast with my parents out on their patio one morning, and I felt obligated to tell them because they love me. And it was really, really hard to do that. And I saw my mom and dad crying, and just kind of like grabbed my hands and just sat there in silence. And then I did tell my brother one night over winter break. I was definitely telling people in waves, but we were in the jacuzzi late at night and it was raining, and we were just talking about just kind of the pain our family has gone through the last few years. And I brought it up and I told him, and he responded in probably the most welcoming and loving way possible. And he didn't say much besides, "I'm sorry and I love you." And then he just embraced me. He just kind of held me there and we cried together, and I just was reminded of who I am, that I can be loved. And we're not just brothers by our physical blood, but because of the blood of Christ, I have been made clean. I'm not dirty. I'm not shameful. I did go through a counseling process as well. Originally thinking I don't need counseling. Counseling's for crazy people. That's not the case. Sometimes you just need to go to someone that has been trained in this and has done this as a profession to help you process because it is very difficult no matter what kind of pain or suffering or event you're going through life. It's just going to that and seeking out help because it's impossible to do it on your own.
And since being back over the last 8 months, what are some triggers that you've experienced that remind you of what happened?
I'd say the main one was, it was in the fall, and we went to like a concert thing at Kreuzberg Coffee House in downtown, and it was a show of like someone that most of you might know is like Megan Sexton or something like that was playing. And I've never been to Kreuzberg before, but there was like a little concert side where it's just narrow and crowded and loud and busy, and people just bumping up against each other and rubbing each other, not in an appropriate way, but just because of the crowd. And when I was there, I just started having like a major anxiety attack. I just started sweating. I got really hot. I couldn't focus on anything. All I could think about is feeling trapped, and just feeling people I don't know like touch me, not intentionally, but just not being able to handle it. And I had to just get out. I couldn't be there any longer, and it was just kind of an emotional night. And so there are little things that trigger memories, and that was one of them, of just being in a crowd. It is hard to trust people, especially people I don't know. And so it's just been a struggle to do that since.
Just the last question, how have you experienced just the gospel of peace and hope?
I think I did kind of touch on it, like feeling like I'm not dirty. I know it's kind of just a stereotypical thing, but I went there to get washed. I went to that Turkish bath to get washed, and I came out feeling dirtier than ever. Yet that's not who I am. That's not the truth. And so it's just this newfound, just, I guess, appreciation for the gospel, of understanding it, that no matter what has happened to you in the past, no matter what you've done in the past, you're not dirty, you're not shameful, you're not unworthy or unlovable, but you are made a son and daughter of Christ, and you're made clean and pure and beautiful. And you are loved unconditionally. And so it's just understanding that more to a deeper level and more intimate level.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, man.
So,
Yeah, like Jay said, there's just a lot of triggers that can continue for a long time after. And a lot of times they're just completely, you can't control them. You don't know when they're going to hit. You don't know what's going to spark, whether it's a smell, a taste, a song. It can be so many things that just spark it, and then all of a sudden, and there's other feelings associated, like there's a feeling of being trapped or maybe powerless, or there's various things that you can feel of taken advantage of, violated. And it can be something so small and not at all a form of abuse, but it can just launch you straight back into all of that. And again, that's trauma, and that can be anything, not just sexual abuse. And one thing about trauma is when you're feeling traumatized in that moment, it's like your front part of your brain freezes and you're not able to think, you just feel. And so there's this like complete freeze of your frontal cortex, and you can't respond. And that's what Jacob was feeling, just this feeling of being paralyzed. There's no way out. And that's a very common thing for people to experience. And so yeah, it's just important to know that there's a whole journey that people have to go through with overcoming a lot of the trauma. And so yeah, and that was a really hard day. And there was other things that happened that we had to walk through. And we definitely experienced the gospel, but we also experienced some of the darkest things you can experience, and then some of the greatest parts of like hope of the gospel. And so I want to touch on self-care, because when you come alongside people, it is a hard thing to do. And with self-care, as you're walking with someone, sometimes it's like after someone shares, okay, after you do the initial do's and don'ts, then what? How do you care for yourself? So as you walk with someone, what I tell people is the moment someone tells you their story, this is just the reality. You're a part of their journey, for better or worse. And you will play a different role depending on what they desire, but it's not just something, oh, we just need to get you to the counselor because they're going to fix it. The counselor is a piece of the puzzle that's going to help bring wholeness in your life, in that person's life. And so I think it's community, it's counselor, it's family, it's the Word of God. It's all these things coming together. There's not one piece that's going to bring this wholeness and healing. And so you want to make sure that you're in the journey, but you also want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. It's not your burden to carry in the sense of every single day, whenever they want, but at the same time, like, you want to be mindful, how do I come alongside? But some self-care tips, though, I get told this information a lot from various people. And so even just a practical thing is making sure, just go for a run, go for a walk, try to make sure that you're healthy emotionally, physically, spiritually. When you're told a lot of trauma, whether it's sexual violence or maybe someone else is suffering, it's very easy to take on that burden, especially if you're more of a feeler and empathetic. And in that moment, you want to be empathetic, but it's also, you need to make sure that you don't carry that every second of the day. And so one thing that I do is, if I'm kind of walking with someone through a lot of suffering, is I just go for a run. That's really life-giving for me. And then there's other resources that you can go to. Maybe you should see a counselor yourself. Go to an on-campus free counselor and just process how you're doing walking someone else through that, because you need to be cared for too. And on the last page, you can see like symptoms of stress. That's for someone who's a victim. But below that is just some things to be aware of taking on someone else's trauma. And vicarious traumatization, I can't pronounce that last word, but that basically means that you're carrying on someone else's trauma and you're having some of their triggers. And so you want to make sure that if these things are happening, that you're getting some self-care and help through the process, because it is a lot to carry. It's a very heavy thing to carry. And so you want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. But within that, there's also this kind of reality that you want to be healthy as you come alongside someone, but there's also just this reality of, as we love people and care for people, we're going to carry burdens and scars and pain that's not our own. And that's just the reality of just the gospel. Whether you're in vocational ministry or not, as if you just love people and come alongside them, there's going to be moments where you are it feels too much to carry. It feels too much to bear. And I remember at a conference about 4 or 5 years ago for Cru, there was this woman who was speaking about sex trafficking, sexual assault, and she had gone to this place in Ethiopia, and there was basically this sex dungeon that 300 men were in. They were trapped there, and the irony too, there was a church on top of it. But so she went there and helped with this whole situation, and all these men were just traumatized, and as she described her journey of going into that dungeon and seeing just the reality of sex trafficking, of sex slavery, she said, many will ask, how do you help someone without being scarred along the way? And she said, that's not possible. When you come alongside other people, you're going to be scarred. Even looking at Jesus, who came down to earth, died, rose again, he still bears the scars of bringing healing into our lives. And that doesn't mean that you play savior. That doesn't mean that you take on more than you should, but just the reality. And when you walk with people and the reality of this world, you're going to be scarred along the way. And there's hope and there's care for you too. And there's a healthiness in that. And some people tend to not be empathetic enough and kind of run away from pain. Others, like myself, tend to bear it way more than we should. And just understanding yourself and where you are. If you're someone who tends to carry more than you should, then you really need to make sure that you focus on self-care and make sure that you're not taking on more. But if you're someone who needs to grow in empathy, really looking at the do's and don'ts and trying to push yourself to be more empathetic. And a couple other things too. I think that it can be confusing if someone from the opposite gender shares this with you. Depending on the relationship, you can share with a close friend that's the opposite gender, but if someone's disclosing this to you, that's a hard road to navigate, and it can be really tricky to know how to handle that. And so I would suggest in that moment, just really kind of still respond with the do's and don'ts. And I would say in that, allow that first moment to pass and then kind of return to that person and just express like, hey, like, I don't think it's the best. I'm the best person. It's hard. You want to be very careful of how you navigate that conversation because you don't want that person to feel rejected. But you also want, if you don't feel comfortable, I tend to do a lot more of this just because I am certified. So I definitely feel a little more comfortable helping women out. But if you're not certified, this isn't your field, you don't have a relationship with the opposite gender, you want to appropriately and very kindly and gently refer to maybe someone else. And just because that could get a little tricky depending on the nature of the relationship. I also want to touch on if it's a significant other. Sometimes you can be in a relationship and someone tells you that this was a part of their past. And this is probably one of the most common things that we experience in our ministry is someone, they're dating, and oftentimes, this is not always the case, but, well, it's actually not the case. A guy or girl could have experienced sexual abuse when they were a kid, in high school, in college. And that's a really hard thing to take on when it's someone you care about and it's a part of their past where you've known them for years or whatever it may be, and it's like, how do I come alongside them? And the self-care part's really important. And if it's someone you care about, the desire to save and desire to carry is gonna be all like even more great. And so you wanna make sure that you probably talk, if it's someone you really care about, if you're in a relationship with someone, I would suggest go see a counselor right away, just so that you're talking through coming alongside the person you love or that you're in a relationship with, you're engaged with, fill in the blank. And because that's just a lot to carry when you care about someone in that way. So, with the last 3 minutes, is there any burning questions someone may have? Maybe a clarification on something I said. Cool. I want to finish by reading a poem from a survivor, and I'm going to pray, and then I'll kind of just be lingering outside if you want to talk more. But I'm going to read this poem. Broken wings and a shattered life, full of strife, overwhelmed by loss, pain, and grief, is now healed with tears of relief. Deep anger at myself is replaced with repentance and acceptance. Forgiveness and release have brought inner peace. Gone, guilt and shame, now no blame. Letting go and allowing my life to flow. No blocks to impede or hold me back. As I am His, I nothing lack. I am okay. No matter what they say, my soul has journeyed from darkness to light. Fear of not being good enough, no longer my plight. Gone the heavy burden of my past. My slate wiped clean at last. The maggots buried deep in my inner core are no more. I acknowledge God in my inner source as my strongest resource. My inner light, now untarnished and bright, providing illumination and inspiration, leaving no room for the deep gloom of yesteryear's dark, empty soul, but a light-filled space that is whole, no longer lost and alone. I have come home to myself, to have love knowing no bounds. Rein of my spirit, fragmentation no longer a limit. I have come full circle, like a snake swallowing its tail. I know I can trust, I will not fail, believing I'm a child of God, a small miracle. Through amazing grace, I have rebirth, a faith in me and renewed self-worth. The way forward full of hope, joy, and love. I see my path clearly now and thank God above. Generations of chains have melted away, setting free the eagle in me. So I'm just going to pray. Lord, I thank you so much for these people, my brothers and sisters, for Jacob and his story. And Lord, I just pray that from here, that we would all just feel so much more confident in you and our ability to come alongside those who are hurting, your children who are hurting. I pray that everyone here would just be an agent of healing to other people, whether it be friends or significant others or people in their Bible studies or family members. Just statistically, Lord, everybody in here knows several people who've been sexually abused or assaulted. They may just not know it. And so I pray that these people would be seen as safe and just healing agents and the light to those around them. And so yeah, Lord, I pray that all of us would just let you carry our burdens, Lord, because our burdens are heavy. And so we want to give those to you, Lord, and allow you to walk with us in this. So we just pray all this in your name. Amen. So last couple things, if you haven't had a blue ribbon, there's some right here. These are for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. There's a bunch you can